Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It's been a while since I've been here, and I'm glad to be back. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the Tower of Babel, and that has been. Oh, I got to do some adjusting here. Get this thing on my screen. Kind of still learning how to do all of this stuff. There's myriad of details that all have to come together in the right time at the right place. So here we are. Appreciate you being here, and we're ready to get going. Tower of Babel, pretty famous Sunday school story. But I think we're going to see, and I hope you see over this time, it's going to be 2 videos. Tonight I'm going to be kind of focusing on more the historical, physical parts of the story. And then next time I'm going to be talking about the supernatural side, the more the darker side of the story. And it's a pretty dark story. And I'll give some hints to that, things to come as we go through this. So we've been through the days of creation, the fall, what happened at the Garden of Eden. Mankind is separated from God and kicked out of the garden, the perfect presence and the perfect environment. And once removed from that, our conditional immortality was gone. And it took Adam 900 years to die. Something did die that day. And I went into that. And then I talked about Noah's flood and how man had become so utterly corrupt that it grieved God that he had made man. But man, in both of these cases, in the Garden of Eden and at Noah's flood, there was a supernatural, malevolent input into the whole situation. And we talked about that. And the Tower of Babel is no different. This is the 3rd phase of the fall of man. And this is where man becomes separated from other men. And it's the birth of the nation state. It's the birth of government or organized government. And we'll see, particularly next time, it is the birth of all the false religions of the world. And there's a couple links in the show notes down below about the origin of all religions in 2 parts. And we'll talk about the nations. In Genesis 10, the whole picture is of families. These are families, but they're also growing and becoming tribes. So the origin of tribalism, the nation family, but more officially when a group of people become a nation when they form a government that helps. It's more than just family. It's more than clan. There is an organized government that goes behind that. And we see that in chapter 10 with the description of Nimrod. I'll get into that a little more next time. But it's all changed. And after this time and next time is the Tower of Babel. And then after that will be, discussion on Abraham and what a critical figure he is. And we'll see kind of where that he came into the picture. So we always are always coming back to this most fundamental picture of reality, is the biblical worldview, that there is a creator and there is a creation. We are not the creators. We are made in his image. We can do a lot of the things that he does on a scaled down version. And also, as part of the fall, we are free moral agents. There's a bunch of people that don't like that, and because they don't understand the creator. And so we, in his image, were created to have the stewardship, dominion over the creation, and we fell. It's not, we didn't, some people try to say, well, we gave it away, and that's not exactly true. But that was back there in the days of creation and that time period. But this dual fashion of reality is that there is a creator and a creation. We are not the creator, and the creator is not his creation. And as different groups of people get those two confused in a variety of ways, it distorts the whole picture. And along with that distortion, we'll see here in a minute, is a distortion of history. And that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is if we have a pretty decent understanding of history, I mean, a real understanding of history, we have a better understanding where we are today and where we're going to end up. So when Jesus came on the scene, he was talking to his the religious leaders of his day, and he said in John 5:46 and 47 that, for if you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? And this is part of the Jesus believed in the writings of Moses. Jesus believed that the book of Genesis was part of Moses. The later writings on the covenant that God made with the Israelites. But they didn't believe Moses. They were kind of selective, like Christians are today. They pick and choose what parts they want to accept and how they're not. And they weren't faithful covenant keepers, because if they were, they would have believed Moses, and they would have believed the things that he spoke about, because later on Jesus communicates all the stuff from the law and the prophets about who he was. So this becomes real important, is that if people don't believe Moses and what he wrote, then how are they going to believe in Jesus? And this is particularly, he's talking to the Israelites of his day, and they just aren't, they're not getting it. But this comes back around later on with an intentionality, the development of the Enlightenment project, which was its purpose was to find a way to explain everything without God. And one of the Enlightenment philosophers was a man named Charles Lyell. He was a Scottish lawyer, and he wrote a book called The Principles of Geology, in which he laid out many of the principles that are used in geology today. And it wasn't that they were a bad idea or entirely false, but that had this underlying motivation. That Lyell said that his life's goal was to free the sciences from Moses. Well, what did that mean? The common consensus of end of 1700s, 1800s, into Charles Darwin's time, was that Moses was the describer of Earth's history, and that Earth's history was catastrophic. Well, James Hutton, Charles Lyell, and Charles Darwin introduced an entirely different way of thinking about this ancient history. And we have the birth, just like we have the birth of organized atheism, we have the birth and the development of atheistic historical revisionism. And part of what they laid out is that things didn't happen in the earth catastrophically, as was pretty obvious to anybody with eyes to see, but things happened gradually, little by little. We'll see an example of that in a minute, but how we see erosional processes today is how it's always been forever and always. For millions of years is introduced into this time period, particularly pointing out the erosion of mountains. So Lyell and those are in his time altered the view of history to a mindset of gradualism, from catastrophism to gradualism. And so when Charles Darwin went on the voyage of the Beagle, 1835, for 5 years, he took 2 books. He took his Bible and he took Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. The more he read Lyell, the less he read his Bible. And over time, he later confessed that disbelief crept over me on a very slow rate, but at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress. You've heard of the principle of boiling frogs. You turn the heat up slowly, and the frog in the water will never know that he's being cooked to death. And that happened to Charles Darwin. Little by little by little, the disbelief, like a cancer, took over his life. And that is how he died, as an unbeliever. And it's very common among no knowledgeable evolutionists that that's exactly what evolution does to the things of God. One guy called it a universal acid. It eats everything in its path. It destroys everything. And there's nothing left when it's finished. Which, God's in the redemptive business, not the universal acid business. So what happened the time of Hutton, Lyell, and Darwin was a shift from the biblical worldview to now we have the modernist, atheistic, evolutionary worldview where there is no God. There is no God, and we're here. So evolution is a fact, even if we never figured out. And the creation is turned into Mother Nature in all of her forms. So it has science and history are naturalized. There is no supernatural causation allowed. And so this fundamental philosophy, there is no supernatural, has dominated every area of life since the 1800s, including the biblical reality. And there has been an attempt to naturalize Scripture, remove the supernatural out of Scripture. You've heard of it wasn't the Red Sea, it was actually the Reed Sea, and it was only 6 inches deep, so the Israelites could walk across easily. Well, that's a naturalization. There's every miracle in the Bible, it has been attempted to be naturalized. Jesus didn't walk on water. He walked on the stones that were just beneath the surface because he knew where they were. There's all of these sometimes ridiculous explanations. But that naturalism has to point to the beginning of all things, to origins as well. Since there is no God and we're here, there are purely natural processes. And that's called materialism. Or with respect to nature, it's called naturalism. That's all there is. There isn't anything else. And so it leaves us, so many people, hopeless, because inside we're made in the image of God and we can never escape that. And so there is this knowing inside of all of us that there's something wrong with the world and I don't know what to do about it. And that's where we get to intersect those people with the gospel, the truth, the demonstration, like Paul said, that I didn't come to you with good ideas. I came to you with a demonstration of the Spirit and power. That your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 2, around 3 to 5. And so that's our privilege, that we get to be involved in the redemptive processes of God to redeem individuals, to redeem families, to redeem nations, and to redeem the earth itself, ultimately in Romans 8. And so when we look out in the world, I mean, this part of the Grand Canyon, we look out in here, we see this, and we think, man, Noah's flood, a year-long disaster, miles of water, reshaping the surface of the earth, putting all these layers down. And then afterwards, another flood comes through and cuts this canyon out. And we don't have any problem with that. Why? Because we know there's a big God behind it. And that his processes, his power, his ability is amazing. He can do what he said he could do. But on the other hand, if you take the gradualism, the slow uniformitarian approach, you think that the sands of all those layers were laid down millimeter by millimeter over millions of years. And then the river came through and carried off one sand grain at a time until it eroded this canyon in here. Oh, going the wrong way. So we have these two extreme views of reality. And there's lots of shades in between. But these are the two major ones. Atheism and Christian theism. God is always at the center of our thinking and our life. Jesus Christ is my life, and I owe him everything. So I can think about, there's presuppositions behind this. What do you believe when you see a picture like this, you have your beliefs, your basic beliefs kick in, and they start up, and you begin with, depending on what glasses you got on, is how you're going to see these pictures. And so as we go into Genesis chapter 10 and the families of the earth, hopefully you'll get a new view and appreciation for everything that God has done. And I'm grateful every day for what God has done in my life. I'm alive today because of Jesus, and I owe him everything. So Genesis 10:1. Now this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. and sons were born to them after the flood. So we've got multiple generations beginning here. And this is what makes this, got this light bouncing off my glasses. So we kind of think things just happen all of a sudden, and it's not like that. The things of God are progressive is not quite the word I want to use, but he goes through processes and things take time. It takes time to have sons and daughters born in multiple generations. And I hope you read Genesis 10 and 11, because you will see that there are multiple generations, sons who have sons who have sons. And it doesn't take long till there is a substantial population that has grown out of all of this. And in particular, notice that it was after the flood. So he's making it real clear. This is all post-flood. The world has been completely reshaped, and it is, we don't know how good or how harsh the conditions were, but when they came off the ark, they were largely, well, they had all the animals they needed. They had the grains that they used to feed the animals. Pretty soon, they're farming. They start off an agrarian society, which is what I was still thinking about, that Adam was the first generation agrarian farmer. And it is considered in archaeological, paleontological circles that agrarianism is a later development. It is a big step in the future of mankind when we learned to manage crops, because unlike a hunter-gatherer society, you're moving around all the time. You don't have to have any settled place. Maybe you're following animal herds or migrations, and you're moving around. But when you become agrarian, you have to have a way to feed yourself until the crops are ready for harvest. So it's considered an advancement. Well, Adam started out agrarian, started out that way. And Noah was started planting. I mean, it wasn't too long before he had a vineyard going. And they were agrarian, and they began to spread out from there. And so Genesis 10:5, from Japheth, the coastland nations were separated into their lands. Japheth moved to the west and became, kind of the Greeks and Europeans, part of those families. And this pattern here, they were separated into their lands. And this is kind of a preview of what's coming in chapter 11. But they were divided. Every one of these families had their own promised land, and they had their own language. That's part of the curse, the judgment from the Tower of Babel, according to their families, and then into their nations. The families of man were now becoming nations. And then there were the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands and in their nations. Kind of pattern repeated. And then the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, and according to their nations. The Shem is where the Semites come from. And we'll see another variant of that coming up. And then verse 32, these were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations, in their nations. And from these, the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. So keep in mind this thing about being divided. That is a big deal. Because when I saw this, it changed my whole thinking on the Tower of Babel and what is different. There's some links down there There's a Michael Heiser Supernatural series, which is an awesome introduction into these things about the nations and the divisions and that kind of stuff. But the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. And in Genesis 13 and in Genesis 28 are a couple examples of where the area got too crowded, so the people had to spread out. And that would have been very common. You're making lots of babies, they're growing up, having more babies, you're getting a larger population in a hurry, and sometimes you get along, sometimes you don't. And if you don't, then you go find your own place to settle. So in this place where the nations were divided, and this becomes critical, and it's actually a few verses earlier in Genesis 10:25, it says, to Eber were born two sons. Eber is where the Hebrews come from. The name of one was Peleg, which means division. For in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Well, Peleg is being named after an event. So it's either just before he was born or very early in his life before he was named that the earth was divided. And I actually used to teach that this was like continental drift or something like that the continents broke apart and with the human populations and they began to spread over the earth. But that's not at all what this is talking about. And in all of the reference to this earth being divided in various forms, it is talking about the nations being divided. Humanity is being divided up and scattered across the earth, like the sower sows the seed to the wind. So, on a timeline, this is the before and after the flood timelines. You see before that the average lifespan was like 900 years. And then after the flood, it was cut in half. Conditions of the earth had so radically changed that the kind of lifespans that they had before the flood could not exist. The corruption of the natural world was becoming destructive to human activity. But then notice there's a yellow circle at the time of Peleg, and he's about 2300 BC. I don't get too excited about many of these dates, but this is 4,000 years ago. And if you know a little bit about history, 4,000 years was a long, long time ago. And it is, this lineage goes all the way down to Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in their timelines. Moses was about 1450 BC. So we're talking 800 years or so before Moses. These populations are growing. This is just one family line. And there's 69 others. Keep that in mind. They're all making lots of babies. That's what they did. And so there's massive populations are growing. There's lots of people. By the time of the Tower of Babel, it's Babel, later on Babylon will become a very large and important city. And we'll look more at that next time, what was going on there. But see, back in Genesis 9, verse 7, God says to Noah and his family, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it. Well, they had done some pretty good multiplying. They had gone, there's Noah, his wife, their 3 sons and their wives, a population of 8 people is now, by the time of the Tower of Babel, 70 families of people. So there, the population boom had begun. But God told him to fill the earth, go back out there and repopulate the world. Well, they didn't do that. And so when we go to Genesis 11, verses 1 and 2, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So the whole earth was one language and one speech. One language, that's kind of obvious, but the one speech means they all use the same dictionary. Whenever they spoke to each other, they didn't have to guess which word form that they were talking about. They had perfect communication. And communication is the real power behind this. And it is a power behind unity. If people aren't speaking clearly, there's a verse that says, if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, how can people be called to battle? How can the soldiers be called to battle? So they had the same language, but they all understood each other perfectly. And so when they journeyed from the east, they found in the land of Shinar, that is sort of Egyptianized, the Hebrewized version of Sumer. If you know about history, you know about the Sumerians. These are the Sumerians. They're the ones that settled there in that region. And here's a map. This came from Google Maps. And they started up at the very top, a little to the right is number one. If you see a little bump in as part of Turkey that goes into Armenia, that little bump that sticks out there to the right is where the mountains of Ararat are. And I don't know why they did it that way, but they wanted to include all of the mountains of Ararat in Turkey. And so if you look on any kind of map of Turkey, when you see this bump that sticks out on the right side, that's where Noah's Ark is at. It's in those mountains somewhere. There's several that claim they have a proof positive that they know exactly where it is in the mountains of Ararat. And it's the mountains of Ararat, plural. It's up there somewhere. If it's left. Stories are heard, it'd be kind of cool. And it is entirely possible that there's still something left up there. But anyway, they migrated down. Some went more to the east and followed the Tigris River. Now, let's see, my mouse works on the screen. So on the east side, kind of over here, is the Tigris River, and then a lot farther to the west in Syria, going up into northern Syria, up into Turkey, is the Euphrates River. And so that some group got onto the Euphrates River and came east down to number 2, where the Tower of Babel was. That's the land of the Sumerians, it became the land of the Sumerians because there wasn't anybody there yet. These populations were migrating into place. It's you can actually type in Tower of Babel, Iraq, and you can see exactly where people think it is, and that's okay. But it's also right there is also Babylon in that same region. So this whole area is all tied together. It's very fertile. Everything growing population up into a city, big city might need is there. Sufficient water. The land is good for crops. They can grow all kinds of stuff. And then later they still continued to move down into where the number 3 is, and that's where the Chaldees. That's ultimately where Abraham comes from. So this migration down from the mountains of Ararat all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba, I think that is. Did I get that right? Anyway, to the Gulf down here. And people are populating this region and building cities. And you can see where in chapter 10, Nimrod did quite a few cities. He was very a prolific city builder. Now the distance is about 700 miles from 1 to 2. You just think it's not that far. 700 miles. That'd be about from where I am to Canada. Not that far. So I just kind of wanted to give you a perspective on where on these migrations and the population, and keep in mind, I don't believe the entire population did, because some of them branched off. I mean, there's a whole you can go northeast up into what is Russia. You can go straight west into Turkey, and which is what it says about Japheth. They moved to the lands, the coastlands, which were some along the Mediterranean, but more it's over towards Greece. Or you can go northwest into Central Europe. Lots of room to move. North would be more difficult because of this time there was a large ice age. The only ice age in Earth's history is going on right now, following Noah's flood. So there's less motivation to go very far north because it was going to be cold. So we get into Genesis 11, verse 4. And the people said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So here's the first thing: it's in rebellion, what God told them to do. Now keep in mind, behind the scenes, just like in the Garden of Eden, just like in Noah's flood, there are malevolent, supernatural beings affecting this whole situation. Okay, they are enticing the people to disobey God. And that's what they're good at that. That's what they love to do. They love to entice us, and then we're in trouble and we want to say, "Oh, they did it." Well, and God said, "No, you did it." We are held accountable for the stuff that we do. So they don't want to be scattered. They want to make a name for themselves. But the real fire here is in this tower whose top is in the heavens. And that is, it's no matter what translation, it's on the misleading side of what's really going on. Because there is a backstory. And it is true that the Israelites knew this backstory. The Jews at the time of Jesus knew this backstory. The writers of the New Testament, and all the writers of the Old Testament, they all understood what this was about. And it wasn't, as I've heard people say, well, they wanted to make a tower so tall that if God ever flooded the world again, he would, they could survive on top of their tower. And it's like, but God promised he never would. And so they're just, that one makes the least sense of all. But what the reality is that on the top of these towers, and was true all through ancient history, the top of these towers was the place you met with the gods. It is the place you conduct business with whatever God, the fallen angels, and just call them what they are, the fallen angels who want to pretend to be these gods. And this is where they're going to do their business. In many ancient culture, there's this idea that the gods needed food, so they would bring food up there. But there's also a darker side to this. They would bring women up here to be impregnated by these fallen angels, just like what happened before Noah's flood. because and I'll get more into this. It's about as far as I want to take this right now, but I'll get into this next time. This is where the giant clans start to come from. And it becomes, I mean, in that region, Goliath and his family were some of the last. This is what these towers, part of what these towers were for. They were for the meeting of the gods, and those meetings had a variety of purposes. So 11:6, and Yahweh said, indeed, the people are one, and they have all one language. Their unity is strong, and this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Now, the demonic world took notice about this, because God himself said that this kind of unity is unbelievably powerful. And so in the demonic world likes to interfere with unity in families, in nations, to disrupt this unity to keep them from accomplishing especially kingdom things, because the growth of the kingdom means they have less space to move, and we want to take it all away from them. We're going to take it all away from them. That's what the Great Commission is all about, delivering the nations from these trespasser gods who have ruled over them for 4,000 years in some cases, some areas, some tribes in the world, places where the gospel is completely unknown. The authority of King Jesus will set those captives free. So God's going to destroy their unity, and he does that by disrupting their language. There's no evidence that he blew over the Tower of Babel or did anything destructive like that. Whatever he did to them, whatever they did, come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So at the minimum, there are 70 languages that the human race gets, each family getting its own language. And we all discover that we can understand each other, so we're going to go off to however God has designated our promised land. And then in Genesis 11:8 and 9, so Yahweh scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. And they ceased building the city, and therefore its name is called Babel, because there God confused their language in all the earth. And it's kind of known almost everywhere to be a babbling idiot has a, hopefully I'm not being like that, but to babble means to speak in a confusing manner. But it also has another meaning underneath. Bab means gate, and El is God. This is where Babylon comes from, is that they were building a gate to the gods. That's kind of what that tower was all about. So God turned that tower, Yahweh turned that tower as a place from meeting with the gods to a place of confusion. And the world never forgot. It's all still there. But notice, over the face of all the earth, and this is 4,000 years ago, how they got to the uttermost parts of the earth, well, we don't know. I doubt he teleported them, but they had some direction and instruction, and they moved along. But let's see, how am I going to do this? So we should find evidence all over the world of advanced human activity. And the fact is, we do. In fact, there is a legend, almost a worldwide legend about this, and it's the legend of Atlantis. The pre-flood people were the Atlanteans. Noah and his family were the last of them. That whole unbelievably complex, advanced culture was destroyed through a flood. And there were some survivors who brought that into the future, and they began to scatter that technology over the face of the earth. It's a very condensed story of the flood, and then the multiplication of all the families that carry that technology all over the world. And it's known to be all over the world. And so we can look for it. We should expect to find it. There's stuff going on in Brazil, as we have, it's called LIDAR, form of radar that can look through the jungle canopy to see structures underneath that are just invisible to the naked eye, but they're finding all kinds of stuff down in the jungles that just shouldn't be there. Well, one of the things that shouldn't be there is a barge, things like that. At the bottom of the Mediterranean was found a barge carrying copper ore. And that copper ore, they did tests on the wood and all that kind of stuff. And they determined that that barge was 2,000 years old. So the time of Christ is when that barge ended up on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. But that barge was loaded with copper ore. And it was a particularly pure ore. On back up here, not quite. The barge, and so they began to wonder, well, where does this kind of quality ore come from? Because nobody knew anything like that in Europe. And so every copper mine and copper ore has a chemical signature, chemical fingerprint. And so they began to do the testing and looking at various copper mines, especially the ones that produce some pretty decent ore, and there just wasn't anything. So they began to look further, and they eventually looked into North America. And so where do you get copper on that? And it was discovered that on the north shore of Lake Superior, there has been copper mining for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. And it was well known that that whole area on the north shore of Lake Superior, the tribes that lived in that area could pick up copper right off the ground. And they could hammer it in, make useful items out of that copper. It was so pure that it was usable right off the ground. And so they traced that ore back to the north shore of Lake Superior, to where this copper mining industry had been going on for 3,000 years. And so that means in the from 0 to 1000 BC, they had been carrying boatloads of copper ore from the north shore of Lake Superior over to the Mediterranean. And its most prominent use was to make bronze. You melt it with tin, and the tin and the copper form a new substance called bronze. And that is very useful. It's harder than copper. They can still melt it and make molds, and weapons and all kinds of stuff are made out of bronze. And it's all over the place. And it's been suggested that the copper ore mines of Europe were insufficient to produce the amount of bronze that has been discovered throughout Europe and the Middle East. Very popular metal. So, and I used to collect these. It comes from a magazine called Ancient America. It's on pre-Columbian archaeology, and there's tons of stuff. I got a whole slideshow on this kind of stuff. So down in Peru, we have these stones that have dinosaurs carved on them, and there's thousands of them, thousands in Peru. If you've heard of Nazca, like the Nazca lines, it's in that area. These people were very prolific in art and whatever kind of science they used to be able to create the Nazca lines. But just about every form of dinosaur, some of these carvings have people riding the dinosaur. So they knew about them. There's a whole field of archaeology called OOPArts, OOPARTS, and it stands for out of place artifacts. And it's just stuff that shouldn't be there. Kind of like a copper ore barge on the bottom of the Mediterranean. It just shouldn't be there. It doesn't fit the standard story. Neither do these stones. Then also there is carvings of elephants that have been found in Central America as well, and then their counterparts, which are come out of Hinduism. They're very similar in style to Hindu carvings. But how did the Central Americans know about elephants? Like what's the, I forgot the date on here. This is 700 or 800 years ago. They were found in 1892, but they go back much older. How did they know about them? Because there's been international travel for 3,000, 4,000 years. And then also there's architecture, Central American architecture related to architecture that comes out of Indonesia and Java, various temple structures that are built. This stuff's all over the place, and it's all over the world that people discover that there are, in fact, man-made objects that just shouldn't exist, but in fact they do. And we turn to the Olmec civilization, which is about 1000 BC, and a grotto was found that's like a little idol place in the rocks where they'd put all these idols, and if you look closely at these, they're not Central American. And then over on the right side of the picture is a trowel for scale. And then there's the stone white, I think they're bone, that have words carved on them. And so somebody said, well, let's look at the language. They began to compare it, and they found out that this Olmec language was very similar to Shang Dynasty Chinese. And over and the similar words. There's examples here of the Olmec writings, the Shang Dynasty Chinese, and then modern Chinese, and then English. And it still means the same. The words still mean the same thing after 3,000 years. And so it's just, and there's many of these that they have found. And it's kind of one of the hidden secrets of the Olmec civilization is what were the Chinese doing in Central America 3,000 years ago? There's also been found a Chinese anchor stone. It's a giant rock with a hole cut in it. They'd put a rope in, throw it overboard, use it for an anchor for a boat. Well, the one I read about came from a quarry in China that had been closed for 1,000 years. So the anchor stone, and what's it doing off of the coast of California? And also stories that at the time of Marco Polo that the Chinese had maps of Western America. There is so many interesting things, but if you're atheistic and evolutionary, there's no way to explain them. But if you understand that these people post flood were geniuses compared to us, they knew technology, and I'll get a little bit more on technology that they didn't know, but used anyway. I'll get into that more next time. But just over and over and over again are these. And there's a great book called The Puzzle of Ancient Man by Donald Chittick. And he just goes through and documents incredible achievements of man worldwide. And it's everywhere. It's on every continent. And this man is a Christian, and he does hold to the biblical worldview, creator creation worldview. And then here's a couple who are not, but you can go like on YouTube and search for amazing ancient technology. Just search ancient technology, and you can find tons and tons of stuff. One of the first books I had, these are actually the first two books. I took these pictures. They're part of my library. By Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock. Neither of these are Christians, so they hold millions of years worldview and aliens. That's part of what they try to say, that the amazing things done by humans were accomplished by aliens. And I'll cover that a little bit more next time. And there are some links down in the show notes to some videos about that kind of stuff. But it's just amazing evidence, just what he says, evidences of Earth's lost civilizations. These ancient post-flood people built large civilizations all around the world. And there is they call it megalithic megalithic architecture, these giant stones that are so perfectly cut, you can't even stick a knife blade in the cracks because they're so marvelously fitted together. And they're giants. We get giant stones. We can't hardly move them. But somehow they knew how to put those stones together and build buildings. Graham Hancock, this book is probably 40 years old now. But Graham Hancock has gotten weird. He thinks everybody should take hallucinogenics under the guidance of a shaman, and that contact with aliens is a really good thing. In fact, in an interview, he was commenting that there's a certain drug you can take that will ensure that you have contact with aliens. It just opens people up to demonic influence. And then the other book by Michael Cremo, Forbidden Archaeology, is basically a catalog of evidence of human activity in every rock layer of the geologic column. That every rock layer has some evidences of human activities in those rock layers. Now, they believe, he's actually Hindu and believes that mankind has been around for millions and millions of years. That's why those evidences are in every rock layer. But the point is that these things catalog real objects that, when understood in the creator creation biblical worldview, they make sense. Humans have been here since the beginning. They have been doing things, making things, metals. You read Genesis 4. They're already making metals and musical instruments, as well as farming and livestock. So there should be, we should find evidences of human activities. Here's an example of one that I like. This bell was found in a lump of coal. It's supposed to be a couple of million years old or something. And a guy was shoveling coal into a furnace and he noticed something kind of sparkle. And so he paused and found this inside of a lump of coal. Shouldn't be there. Absolutely an out of place artifact. And there's necklaces. We very rarely handle coal by hand anymore. So these things are not seen as automation and giant machines are all have taken over that task. Humans very rarely have their eyes on the coal. And so a lot of that stuff just goes into the furnace and probably is destroyed. But anyway, next time I'll get into the supernatural part of the fall. And that is a wild ride, because just like in the Garden of Eden, there was a fallen angel involved. Just like in Noah's flood, there were a fallen angel involved. And just like in the Tower of Babel, there were fallen angels involved. And that had massive consequences for the Israelites when they came out of Egypt to move into the promised land. God told Abraham that they'd be there 400 years. Well, the giant clans were very active in those days. And so I thank you, and I hope you have a good night. King Jesus bless you and keep you and guide you. And I hope you get in the scriptures, you read these things for yourself, and then you do the research. See what you see. And as we understand these things, we see the connections to the gospel. The Messiah was going to restore us back to the presence of God and bring back life. That's what he did. That's what was lost in the Garden of Eden. Then he was going to restore the righteousness of man, which was lost at the tower, at Noah's flood. We had become utterly polluted with demonic activity. Jesus has redeemed us from unrighteousness and has given us the gift of righteousness. Thank you, Jesus. Then in the Tower of Babel is the restoration of the family of man. That in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, for we are all one in him. That is the redemption of the nations, of the family of man in Christ, but also the redemption of the nations. And there's somewhere around 200 prophecies that talk about that through the Old and New Testament. And that is the Great Commission, to make disciples of all the nations. Doesn't say make converts in every country, but that's the bare minimum. It does say that we are to Christianize nations. That's what we're here for, because it brings an environment of righteousness, and which lowers the criminality, lowers the whole mentality of just corruption, and it makes the world a better place for everybody. There's so many things left to discover. Hallelujah. And that's his plan. And so I thank you, and pray you have a wonderful night. Bye.
The name of Jesus was into battle against the enemy like a hungry lion. I will not be afraid, nothing is wrong, the Son of the Mighty